All right. We were saying that Luke tells us that he used written documents. He says, many have undertaken to draw up an account of these things. And when he says draw up an account, that is speaking of written documents that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. Therefore, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, it seemed good also to me to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught. Luke used written documents. Furthermore, the sayings of Jesus we can understand as coming down word for word orally, but would the description of the narrative come down exactly the same in three different writers writing at different times and places? It doesn't seem very likely. Now, you could imagine a saying here or there, being word for word, passed around through different oral traditions. But an entire gospel story, that would be required if the sources were oral. Another thing speaking against this is that the order of the synoptics, the order of the stories and sayings is generally the same, with Matthew and Luke diverging some, but never agreeing against Mark. What are the odds that the order would be the same if it was totally oral? Not very likely. Even details like parenthetical material gives away the fact that there was a common written source. By this, I mean the casual phrases like, let the reader understand, in Matthew 24:15 and Mark 13:14 and 16. He says, let the reader understand. He doesn't say let the listener understand, but let the reader. And in Mark 2:10, Jesus says, but that you may know that the Son of Man has authority to forgive sins, he said to the paralytic, I say to you, it goes on. That little phrase, I say to you, or no, he said to the paralytic, that little phrase, explanatory phrase put in there, how likely is it that two people independently would put in exactly the same phrase in the middle of the sentence that Jesus is saying? It's not very likely. Now, some of those who hold to the oral theory see it as being a very complex thing. Here is a chart from Rainer Reisner. And you can see how complex he thinks this is. Now, you're not going to be tested on this at all, but I just want you to see his theory here about how the Synoptic Gospels came to be. And this is primarily oral. So he sees this as a much more complex process. Here, the three synoptics are not dependent on each other or on a Q document. The process depends on both oral and written documents in the form of informal notes that were taken during Jesus' ministry. Okay, I'm not going to go into detail on this at all, but it's just for your information. Okay, do you have any questions about the oral theory? Okay. All right, let us go on then. The Augustinian hypothesis. Matthew was written first. Mark used Matthew. Luke used Matthew and Mark. So this is the way the Augustinian hypothesis looks. Making myself a note here. Okay, now this also has Matthean priority. It says Matthew was written first, but then it says Mark used Matthew, and then Luke used Mark and Matthew. Okay, so the chronological order here is the same order that we have in the New Testament. Matthew, Mark, Luke, in the Augustinian hypothesis. This doesn't have much of a following today. And let us go on to Matthew's possible use of Mark and Luke. This has recently been proposed by Martin Hingel and N.T. Wright, that Mark was written first. So again, it's Mark in priority. Luke used Mark, and then Matthew used Mark and Luke. Okay, it's very similar to the earlier one that we had there, except Luke and Matthew, their places are reversed. So this also would eliminate the need for Q. This also would explain the agreements of Matthew and Luke against Mark in the triple tradition. And then one more proposal, and that is the three-source theory. Wright and Bird, in their book, The New Testament in Its World, suggest this possibility, the three-source theory. So we have Mark and Q, and we have Matthew and Luke. This all is the same as the two-source hypothesis, okay? But in this, Luke uses Matthew as well. Okay, so we have the two-source hypothesis with Luke using Matthew. Of course, Luke would have his special sources, and Matthew would have his unique sources. So maybe this should be called the five-source theory. And this is based on the premise that there was much more flexibility in the first century than most people realize. Okay? So those are the options. Most scholars hold to the first one that we looked at, the two-source or four-source hypothesis. So that we have Mark and Q, Matthew and Luke used both of those and then their unique sources. Okay. Questions or comments here?
So doctor,
yes.
What is accepted by most people, most scholars?
Most scholars accept the first one that we looked at. That would be the two-source hypothesis. okay, that we had Mark and Q, that Matthew and Luke used Mark and Q, and then they had their own unique documents or sources. Okay? Other questions? So this is the synoptic problem. And you can see that there are several theories on which, how they came together. But like I said, most go with the 2 or 4 source hypothesis. All right, then let us go on. Okay, we have been looking at then source criticism. What were the sources for the Gospels? Now we're going to move to form criticism of the Gospels. The practice of form criticism actually began with the Old Testament studies by Hermann Gunkel and Hugo Gressmann. And Gunkel proposed the JEDP theory of the formation of the Pentateuch. But we're not going to go into that at all. The pioneer of New Testament form criticism was the German theologian Martin de Bailius. The most famous promoter of form criticism was another German theologian, Rudolf Bultmann. Form criticism is an attempt to isolate certain kinds of elements in the Gospels. It seeks to get back to the oral period and discover the reasons the particular stories, or we could call them pericope, were put into the Gospels. It stresses heavily the life situation of the church. And theologians use the term Sitz im Leben for life situation. So the focus here is what was going on in the church when the Gospels were formed. Source criticism focuses on the life of Jesus. Form criticism focuses on the situation in the church. So the New Testament has 3 life settings. The life of Jesus, the focus of source criticism. The early church, the focus of form criticism. And the gospel writer, or the evangelist, the focus of redaction criticism. Now, most evangelicals, myself included, reject most of the conclusions of form criticism. Let's say, first of all, that form criticism itself is not necessarily bad, but the presuppositions of most of those who used form criticism were bad. And so if you go in with wrong presuppositions, you're going to come out with wrong presuppositions or with wrong conclusions. Like they say on computers, garbage in, garbage out. If what you put in there isn't good data, then what you come out with is not going to be good. So garbage in, garbage out also applies to form criticism and to all the studies of the New Testament. If you come in with presuppositions that say there is no such thing as a miracle, or that Jesus Christ was not divine, that is going to affect where you come out. So let's look at the method. The method of form criticism is to analyze the stories of the New Testament and discover how they came into being during the oral period of transmission of the teaching about Jesus before the Gospels were written. So this assumes that all the stories of Jesus were transmitted orally, not in writing. So they would say that Matthew did not make any notes, during Jesus' ministry that he used in writing his gospel. They would say it was done orally. Probably everybody agrees that there was a period of time in which stories of Jesus were transmitted orally. But that doesn't mean that there couldn't have also been written documents about the life of Jesus alongside the oral tradition. Even after the Gospels were written, there was still oral transmission. Now, formed critics generally say that there was a long period of time of this oral transmission, and that the Gospels were written in the last few years of the first century. Let me see if I can go here and pull up the whiteboard. This is a cross, and this represents the life of Jesus, life, death, resurrection of Jesus. And this is a timeline. And down here, we have the time of the writing of the Gospels. So this then would be the period of oral transmission. As you can tell, I can't write very well on this, but I hope that you can read some of it. If you can't, it makes me feel good just to be able to write it. So put up with me, please. Okay, so this form criticism says that during this time, there were stories transmitted about Jesus. The question is, why are the stories that we have in our New Testament, why are those stories there? Okay? What caused the writers of the Gospels to put in those stories and those sayings? The form critics say that these sayings of Jesus that came through here did not have a context. They were just random sayings that were there. And so the gospel writers wrote the stories to introduce the sayings of Jesus, to give them some kind of context. So for form criticism, the gospel writers were editors. They weren't authors. They used scissors and paste to put together stories about Jesus. The exception to that would be the passion narrative, the trial, death, resurrection of Jesus, because that has a chronological setting to it. But they would say that the stories, the sayings here, have no really any chronology. Okay, let me see if I can close this out here. Okay. Let's just look at this. The form critics say that the sayings of Jesus had no settings, so the evangelists made up a setting to fit the saying. The form critics also believe that the stories of Jesus, the pericopes, were transmitted as separate, detached units with no chronology. The gospel writers then put them together into the order that we now have. Their role was collectors rather than authors. The exception to this was the Passion narrative, which has a chronological sequence. Now, they classified these sayings in different ways. And here we have Martin Debelius, Rudolf Bultmann, and Vincent Taylor. And these are the different kinds of sayings or stories that we have here. And if you go across, those are different ways of describing the same thing. So Martin Debelius calls certain ones paradigms. Rudolf Bultmann calls the same thing apophthegms. I don't know how to say that word. And Vincent Taylor, pronouncement stories. And you can go through there and see how they classify these pericopes and say that each one had a different kind of function. So we're not going to go into the meaning of these. Suffice it to say that according to the Form critics, these stories developed in predictable ways for predictable purposes according to a way that oral traditions develop in cultures. So the form of the story tells of the function that it had in the early church. Okay, we'll stop here. Let us stop here and take a 10-minute break. And we'll come back then in 10 minutes. All right.